easier to interact there.
Yep.
Maybe if we just confirm that we are online, if someone is watching on Facebook, so we can start.
Il video è in diretta ora. Siamo in
Okay,
diretta.
cool. So we just confirm. Okay. So let's start maybe with Anita.
Bene. Buonasera
Allora,
a tutte. Cominciamo il nostro evento.
No, un telefono.
Io
Di chi è il telefono che suona?
Sono la responsabile legale della Casa delle Donne di Milano. E che cos'è la Casa delle Donne? Noi lo sappiamo, però lo ridiciamo. È il luogo in pratica che segna anche istituzionalmente la presenza delle donne nella nostra città. La Casa delle Donne è nata non molti anni fa, è nata 7 anni fa, però attraverso un processo di partecipazione attiva di centinaia di donne che hanno posto all'amministrazione comunale l'esigenza di uno spazio pubblico specifico per le donne e le loro attività culturali, sociali e aggregative. Traduci?
yes. So Anita Sonego is the president of the Casa delle Donne di Milano, the House of Women in Milan, which is a place that has pushed for an institutional presence of women in the city. This is a place that was born, let's say, not many years ago, but it was born out of a movement of active citizenship by women. It hosts many activities, and it is a place, a public recognition of women in the city.
E nel tempo poi sono sorte varie attività, vari gruppi, c'è la scuola di italiano per le donne migranti, una bibliomediateca, un gruppo che si prende cura del benessere delle socie e delle donne che vogliono partecipare, poi c'è un gruppo che cura il giardino della casa che prima era un macello, c'è uno sportello di orientamento ai servizi sociali per le donne e di sostegno psicologico. Poi addirittura c'è ancora un gruppo storico che pratica l'autocoscienza, un gruppo molto frequentato, e c'è un gruppo che mantiene le relazioni politiche a livello internazionale delle donne, c'è una cucina etica e molto altro, perché altrimenti l'elenco è lunghissimo.
Okay, so just to name a few of the activities that the House of Women is currently, working on. There is the school, the Italian School for Migrants, for example, and there is also a Mediatek, and there is a group that deals with well-being. A group that actually takes care of the garden of the house, as well as there is a place where for social services, let's say, for people to let's say use, and also of psychological help. Then there is still the group of self-consciousness, and a group that is also pushing for international political relations.
E poi nella casa molto spesso vengono presentati testi teorici, saggi, poesie, romanzi di autrici italiane internazionali. È proprio in questo contesto che la casa da parecchi anni partecipa alle giornate di Book City.
Okay, it's also a place where to present publicly texts, theoretical texts by Italian authors, but also international authors. And within this framework, the house participates to Book City, which is the festival that is hosting this event today.
È stato quindi ovvio che nascesse la collaborazione con la Triennale di Milano per presentare l'Atlante delle donne, che poi dopo sarà presentato, che è una mappatura a livello mondiale delle conquiste, ma anche delle criticità, degli obiettivi che le lotte delle donne hanno permesso di raggiungere o sono ancora ostacolati dalle politiche improntate al dominio patriarcale così difficile da mettere in discussione.
Mm-hmm. So it was, let's say, obvious within this framework, you know, to make this connection, to present this book with us from the project Sex and the City with of the Triennale and the Municipality of Milan. In order to present this book by Joni Seager that we have today, which is, let's say, a mapping of the global challenges of women, successes and criticities, let's say, that we will, you know, present today.
È l'Atlante delle donne, quindi ringrazio l'autrice perché oltre a essere uno strumento per conoscere il mondo, è uno strumento soprattutto per cambiarlo. E di questo le sono molto grata.
So she's very thankful to you, Joni, because you know, this book represents not only a tool for knowledge, but also a tool for transforming reality.
Grazie.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so now we move.
Okay, and maybe
Florencia.
Okay. So good evening to everyone, and thank you all for being here, for your participation. It's a very nice opportunity to be here with all of you, even, I mean, in digital version, with the Casa delle Donne that hosts us, with Joni Seager, so far from us, and nevertheless so close today as everyone else. And with our guests, Sveva Magaraggia and Mariana Dotti. I mean, we were saying before that probably without coronavirus emergency, we wouldn't have organized this event. So let's take advantage of the few benefits of this sad condition. We are indeed very happy to have the possibility to present this wonderful book, which really has the ability to show a global picture through these beautiful graphics. So briefly, I wanted to explain something about the research project Azzurra and I are developing with the support of Triennale di Milano and Comune di Milano, and around which we decided to organize today this presentation. So Sex and the City is a gender reading of urban spaces with particular focus on the city of Milan. Through a series of meetings and a research project, we are trying to understand how women use the city, what specific needs they have, how do they feel walking in the street, what services the city offers them when they need help. The project aims to build a sort of atlas itself of the city of Milan, able to show how women live today in the city and how the public administration could act to make their lives better. Sex and the City was one of the winners at the Urban Factor call promoted by the Urban Center of the Municipality of Milan in collaboration with Triennale di Milano. You can find more information about the project if you want on the website, which is sexandthecity.space. And that's all. I mean, I let Azzurra introduce the guests who are here with us today. And I thank you, all of you, again, for being here with us and enjoy the presentation.
Okay, thank you. I'll just...
Microfono, Azzurra.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. So, yeah, thank you so much. And I will try to, you know, keep it as short as possible, but just to give a brief introduction of all our guests today. So first of all, let me introduce Joni Seager, who is the author of this beautiful book that we're presenting today, The Atlas of Women. And Joni Seager is a feminist geographer. She has been the Dean of the Faculty of Environmental Studies of the York University in Toronto. And now she teaches at Bentley University of Boston. She's well known international for her work on feminist environmental policy and the environmental cost of the armed force and on climate change. She has authored many books, including the multi-award winning edition of the Women's Atlas. And she has been consultant of the United Nations and UNESCO for its numerous projects on gender policy and environment. Then we have invited to discuss this book today Sveva Magaraggia, who is associate professor at the Department of Sociology and Social Research of Milano Bicocca University. She holds a PhD in applied sociology and research methods at Milano Bicocca. In 2012, she was awarded an David Research Fellowship, and she conducted research on media representation of gender relation in parenting practices in Sydney. Maybe I'll just keep it short, otherwise there's so many things about Sveva as well. And also then to Maria Nadotti, who is a journalist, essayist, editorial consultant, and translator. She lived in New York from 1980 to 1992, and she subsequently spent long periods in Palestine. Today, she lives between Milan and Berlin. She writes about theater, cinema, art, and culture for Italian and foreign newspapers, including Il Secolo XIX, Il Sole 24 Ore, Lo Straniero, Indice, Art Forum, etc. Okay, I think that's it for the guests. And maybe, you know, before we would like to pass the word just for a few words to the publisher, di Editore, to ask them, you know, why, or, you know, how come they have decided to publish in Italy this book, because it was, you know, as we said, multi-awarded internationally, but it has just been published in 2020 in Italy. So just, you know, their perspective on what's the urgency of such a book in Italy now. But just, you know, to make it clear, the book we are going to present today is basically a huge research done by Joni Seager, that is summarized in more than 200 maps that are somehow synthesizing an enormous amount of data on gender, on so many aspects of women's life all around the world. Not only women, but let's say all what is, you know, what occurs under the gender lenses all around the world. So it's a huge work what we are presenting today. But I'm sure Joni will, you know, present it in depth. But now, you know, just a few words by Giulia, maybe.
Yes. So good evening, everybody. And yes, Ad Editore, it's a small publisher based in Turin. We publish essays, but we also have some feminist book. And I think that Women Atlas, it's actually the cornerstone of our feminist publications because of the huge quantity of data that Joni actually searched for that simply wasn't there before this book. The lack of data on women condition, it's well known. And thanks to the huge work that Joni Seager has done for this, now this book is available to everybody, and everybody can see and study how women live throughout the world. So why we publish this? Because it was simply extremely necessary, and it was something that it is an honor to have on our catalog. And just one small thing before leaving word to Joni, the book was published on March the 4th, and we know it was 10 days probably before the entire lockdown of Italy, but it was a great success, and we know that this does not have an expiring date. So we hope that this is the first presentation with Joni of a long series. And from all at the editore, we hope to see you soon in person. And thank you so much for this opportunity of bringing the atlas to so many people.
Cool. So maybe we'll just pass it to Joni at this point.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be with you and very impressed by even just the little bit I know about the Sex and the City program. As a geographer, I would actually urge you to do an atlas of Milan from the women's, from a gender point of view. I would urge you to do that. But, and thank you to La Casa della Donna for collaborating. And to my wonderful publisher in Italy. Hi, Julia. We have communicated so many times by email. It's very nice to see you. So I thought that what I would do is I will speak or make a presentation for no more than 30 minutes, if that's okay. And then we will have discussion and questions. So I thought that I might just start with a literally 30-second video that the British publisher put together. It gives people who haven't seen the book just a very quick introduction. So I'm going to share screen and just run very quickly through this snappy video.
You are invincible, you are a light, shining forever, so powerful and bright. It may take a long time to find your song. Remember, you have to be stronger, fighting for what you believe. Only then you will perfectly be that special someone.
Great. So that's a very quick glimpse at it. So I have as I say, a short presentation and I'll talk through it. If I'm going too fast or if the imagery isn't clear, please feel free to interrupt. These are some of the editions of this atlas. I'm very pleased that it has been published in several countries around the world. And the Italian edition is very near and dear to my heart. And as I say, the publisher in Italy has been just fantastic. So let me start by asking rhetorically the question of why map things or why put things in graphics? The short answer is because I'm a geographer and it feels like a very natural way of revealing information. But one of the things that I especially like about mapping is that you don't need to be a specialist to get information. So even a very unsophisticated reader, even a grade school student can look at, let's say, this map, which is an abbreviated map of HIV in East and Southern Africa. And you can just look at the colors. I mean, just look at the colors and you can say, well, we know that as a broad region, Southern Africa is the global hotspot for HIV/AIDS. But then you can look within Southern Africa and you can see where, in fact, there's much more concentration and much more prevalence of this particular disease. So even at the most basic level, you can just look at a map and say, huh, I wonder why all of these countries are one color and these countries are another color. This map put beside it on child marriage in the USA similarly shows the power of just using mapping to show patterns. Many of us, particularly in the West, think that child marriage or girl-child marriage, which is mostly what the child marriage is, We mostly think of it as a problem of poor countries or somewhere over there, wherever there is. But in fact, in the USA, and I would bet in Italy, there's a remarkably strong prevalence of child marriage. And so this map again of child marriage in the USA, the darker red colors show where the prevalence is higher, and then down to the blues, which show where there's less prevalence. Now, I live here in Massachusetts, and we are in the liberal Northeast. And so this map in some ways reinforces our bias about social problems in the South and the Midwest. But I don't show this map simply to reinforce my bias, but to show you that it actually should spark your curiosity and my curiosity about why there is more prevalence of child marriage in some regions and not in others. So for me, mapping is a very powerful way of displaying information that at its best invites people in who aren't specialists. I don't want to make too large a claim for it, but I would say that mapping and data visualization democratizes information. It just makes information accessible. So this, for example, is a very small graphic that shows women's earnings in the United States as a proportion of white men's earnings. And you can see that Asian women on the whole earn an average of about 90% of white men's earnings, and so forth all the way down to Hispanic and Latina women who on average earn 54% of the average white men's earnings. Now, if I had just put these 6 numbers on a page, 90% to 77 down to 54, it would be very uninteresting, and most people wouldn't even bother to look at it, or they wouldn't take away information from it. But even this very simple graphic, and this is a very basic graphic, allows a reader to quickly at a glance, just by looking at the circles, to see what the information is. So that's why I say data visualizations democratize information by allowing people who don't think of themselves as specialists to come into the information. So why did I start mapping women's world in the mid-1980s as a graduate student in geography? There was enormous amount of thematic mapping, which just means mapping topics. In the world, you could buy atlases of railways or wine or exploration, mostly men's exploration, but there was absolutely no mapping representation of women's lives. I mean, none. So with a colleague, Annie Olson, we decided that we should do a women's atlas. And this is the American cover here, which is kind of a dumb graphic, I have to say. It's not a very good graphic, but this is the British cover, which I love a lot, even from 1986. So we produced with a small publisher in England who had a great deal of success with political mapping. We produced the first women's atlas. And this current edition that we're talking about today is the 5th edition in this series. So in 1986, back in those days, as authors, we had tons of ideas about what we wanted to map. But as you might imagine, in 30 years ago, global data was very scarce. It was very hard to find international information. There was very limited curiosity about women's lives or the role of gender. And I mean limited curiosity both among colleagues of mine in the geography profession. I mean, many people asked us when we talked about doing a women's atlas, they kind of looked at us in that kind of unbelieving way and said, oh, but what would you put in a women's atlas? It was like, yeah. So there was a great deal of limited curiosity. the official institutions that collect information. So the World Bank, the World Health Organization, collected very little information about women. And it was very hard to retrieve. In 1986, there was no internet, no email, pull down these great big volumes. So now what do we find? Well, information is much easier to retrieve. I mean, you just go on the internet and there is a very great deal of women's information, gender information. Of course, one of the problems now is that much of that data is of questionable origin. That is, you see a lot of stuff on the internet that you just know you should be wary about, or you can't necessarily just take at face value. So on the one hand, there's now so much more information. On the other hand, much of it is not very useful, in fact. So you have to be a very careful user of data on the internet. And we all know that in many aspects of our lives. However, I will say that now there is considerably more a broader vision and new approaches and new types of data that are collected by, for example, the World Bank, which now actively collects information on property rights or land ownership by women. The World Health Organization has a violence against women database. We know a great deal more about topics such as sex trafficking or child marriage. And I would say we know more about those topics because of feminist organizing. More about that in a minute. But it isn't just magically that these institutions have suddenly decided to collect information from women. It's because they've been pressured by feminist activists. And so now we have this atlas, my atlas, which I'll start to show you in just a moment, which has almost 200 pages of information about education and property and poverty and power, women in power or excluded from power. It's just an extremely wide range. It's possible now to do a very wide-ranging survey of the state of women. And that's what this atlas intends to provide. But I would say that even though there's a lot more information now, we still see a quite narrow perspective. And I'm going to explain these in just a moment. So I would say that much of the information about women is seen through a productionist or reproductionist lens. Power relationships are very hidden, especially around bodily integrity and the right of women to control their own bodies. There's a focus on equality, not equity. And of course, the gender data is just binary, men, women. So for example, this is a classic, easily obtained map. I mean, the data is easily obtained to show women in the waged workforce. So this is the productionist, what I call the productionist bias of data. This kind of information about women in the waged workforce, you can get this everywhere now in official sources. However, as a feminist, of course, we want not only to ask about women in the waged workforce, in the official workforce, but about all the uncounted work that women do at a much higher rate than men do. And so what I try and do in this atlas almost all the time is to show, kind of the classic data such as this, because it is, I think, useful and important to have information about women in the formal workforce. But then to balance that, or to, in conversation with that formal data, to show what a feminist curiosity would reveal, which is to ask about, you know, who's doing the unpaid work in the household? What kind of work is that? And of course, in these last few months under COVID, there's been a lot of attention to the amount of unpaid work that particularly women and men, but women at a much greater rate, are doing in households just to keep households moving forward. This cartoon is one of my favorite American feminist cartoonists, a woman named Nicole Hollander, and this is now quite an old cartoon. And she has this character, Sylvia, who's always in her bathrobe, often with a cat. And I remember when this news story came out, and this was a real news story in the 1990s. So the television is saying, over the past 10 years, men have increased their participation in household tasks by 6 minutes. And that was a true story. The US Census came out with that. So in this cartoon, the news item is being discussed or being revealed that women have increased their household labor by 6 minutes. And this character is saying, mercy, it's the revolution and I'm still in my bathrobe. And I have to say, I love this cartoon. It makes me laugh even now. So that's a productionist, a reproductionist since the 1980s and still today. One of the core data sets you can get internationally are things such as numbers of children per woman or contraceptive use. International agencies are particularly interested in the proportion of women who are using different types of contraceptives. So in this sense, it reflects a curiosity about women as they are fulfilling their socially assigned roles. So you get these kinds of data sets on the average number of births per woman. And again, I include these in my atlas because I think it's important to have this basic information. And again, I would show here the wonderful illustration of how mapping information reveals patterns. I mean, if I just gave you all of this global data on a large spreadsheet, you would not see patterns. But once you map, you start to see patterns. So here in the pink and the red are the largest average number of births per woman. So here we have kind of the, if you will, the official discussion about women's reproductive activities. But when you want to look at reproductive rights, it's very difficult to get information. There is a single data set on abortion laws. Most global information sets don't touch abortion. They don't want to be dealing with what is in many places seen as controversial. And there's absolutely no standardized place, absolutely no single place that you can go to find out about women's reproductive autonomy. So for example, those places where women need male authorization to get an abortion. So you can compile it, but it's very difficult. So for example, here's the official map on the legal status of abortions. And then again, I try to correct that or to widen the vision of that official data by trying to reveal this kind of information, some of the places where women need their husband's consent to get an abortion. So abortion may or may not be different levels of legality, but here it doesn't really matter what the law says if you need your husband's approval. And this portion here shows, I know it's too difficult for you all to read, but just to give you an example, this is in the United States, the number of local level, state level laws that have been passed to restrict women's rights to abortion. So again, no matter what the law says, women's access to abortion doesn't necessarily align with the law. And there are a lot of women missing from from international data sets. Lesbians are often completely invisible, or maybe included under categories of gay. People who are gender non-conforming, it's too small a population for official data sets. Older women are often invisible in the main data sets, and I think it's because they are seen as not being productionist nor reproductionist. So this whole area of what I call body politics is absent from mainstream information sources. So, of course, in this atlas, I really try to focus on those things. So this is a spread about those places where men can avoid prosecution for rape if they then marry the woman they have raped. Now, I just want to think about that for a moment. So if a man rapes a woman and then marries her, which she may or may not agree to be married, perhaps he makes a deal with her family, then he gets off on, he doesn't get charged with rape. So there are still a lot of places in the world which have this impunity for rape through marriage. And this wonderful, horrible advertisement here is from an advocacy group in Lebanon, a feminist advocacy group that really took on this issue and in fact eventually prevailed and made the government repeal its rape impunity law. Again, we look at child marriages and how that is distributed in different parts of the world. This is, I think, one of the most graphically wonderful spreads in the book. It's really a beautiful image. Of course, a horrible topic, the murder of women. And this is an example of when I couldn't find a complete data set, which of course the data set does not exist on the murder of women, we try to find a graphically interesting way of showing, you know, individual facts or kind of snippets that give a sense of the enormity of this problem. One of my favorite new topics in this edition of the Atlas was the whole right to pee movement. And I'm sure the Sex and the City project has looked at access to toilets and the difficulty of access to toilets for women in urban spaces. And one of the most active right to pee movements has actually come out of India, where there's been enormous amount of feminist activism. So I'm very pleased that we put this in the Atlas. I would say that one of the problems of mapping at a global or national scale is that there's an overgeneralization that is, you know, if Canada is colored all as green in whatever category that data set represents, well, we know in Canada, not all women in all across Canada experience the same social conditions or realities, and men don't either. But at the scale that I'm mapping, there's an awful lot of generalization. So I also try to include in this book kind of reminders to ourselves not to overgeneralize. So for example, this is a graphic that I have in the book about women winning the right to vote. So for example, in the US, we say that women won the right to vote in 1920, but that's just celebrated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, that where women won the right to vote was just celebrated. But of course we know that Native American men and women had a very different later date of suffrage. Puerto Rican women had a later date of suffrage. In some cases, literate women got the vote before non-literate women. And so this date of 1920 is the official date, but it needs to be understood in the context, in an intersectional context. Similarly, in South Africa, if you look in a reference book, it'll say women won the vote in 1930, but that's not true. It's only white women who won the vote in 1930. Similarly, in Australia, there are lots of countries where some women won the vote before other women. So throughout the book, I try to put in these correctives that say to ourselves, but wait, but wait, let's look again. I also have this very wonderful little cartoon figure of a meerkat. Many of you might know meerkats. They're very appealing desert animals, primarily in Africa, and they often stand upright with their paws in front of them. I asked our graphic designers to put in a meerkat because I think they're very cute. I just think they're very cute animals, but also because they're always alert, and meerkats are always paying attention to what's going on in their communities. They have great situational awareness, we might say. So we have this device, this graphic device of having this cute little animal with this expression, just saying, which is an English expression. I don't know if there's the equivalent in Italian, but it's kind of a sarcastic little aside. It's like, oh yeah, just saying. So throughout the book, we have this meerkat who has these little asides, such as giving little tidbits of information around climate change and prostitution, or about higher education, and making this little observation about something being female infanticide. So I love the meerkat because it just adds visual interest and as an alert animal who's always making observations about her environment. I also try throughout the atlas to focus on and to feature feminist activism, because most of the advances that women have made, certainly over the last 30 years, and I would say over the last 300 years, have been because of feminist activists. So this is really important to feature this, and this is just a little word cloud of some of the feminist activism of recent years. And finally, people often ask me kind of what has improved, what's the good news? And globally, the good news, one of the really most obvious good news features is in girls' education. And in fact, we're now at the point where at current rate, boys and girls around the world will have equal access to education sometime in the next decade. And that, I mean, may seem like even that's too long to wait, but in fact, that's quite an accomplishment, and that's quite a leap forward, even from when I started doing the first of these atlases in the late 1980s. So one of the really good news kind of steps forward for women and girls is in greater access to education. Now, again, I would caution us all to say that, well, often that education is only at the lowest level of education, and girls are pulled out of school earlier. But still, if news, I can say girls' education is a good news. And improvements in literacy, which again, along with education, literacy has improved significantly. However, we have to remember that illiteracy, lack of literacy, is still a problem for about 800 million adults, 2/3 of whom are women. And these, again, the power of mapping, this shows the highest illiteracy states. So I think at that point, I will stop the presentation and open it up for conversation or questions. Over to you.
Cool. Thank you so much for this first round. Very intense, Joni. So we had imagined now, you know, a sort of conversation, let's say. So, you know, we would like to hear comments or questions, perhaps first from our guests. And then, you know, we can also start to collect questions if there are from, you know, the public that is connected either here on Zoom or also on Facebook. So, you know, we can then start to have a conversation. So I don't know if now either Maria or Sveva want to start with some comments.
Yes, I can. Shall I? Okay.
Sure.
Hi, Maria.
You are fantastic. And
Thank you.
It's not only the book, which is amazing, but the way you present your ideas and the way you present your feminist ideas. There is an energy and how can I say, it's so limpid and so necessary to be limpid and clear, crystal clear. Thank you. So I love the book, and I think that the book is precious, not only because it gives us information and a political perspective on data and information, but bizarrely enough, this atlas, which is supposed to speak of women, basically speaks of everything. Speaks of men, speaks of animals, of trees, water, sky, political institutions, culture, love, sex, everything. Which means, feministically speaking, that to speak about women is to speak of the world, not of a problem of poor women. To speak of women, and you make it so clear, is to speak of everything. So, now what I want to underline is that doing what you did, Joni, you basically demonstrate that it's not a matter of pink quotas and numbers and this kind of, the numbers are very important, obviously, but basically you make clear that numbers are not enough. That you make very clear that the matter of the whole research is power. So, you know, it's not a matter of saying I want more power as a woman, but I don't like the concept of power on. So, and this is the very first thing I want to underline. And then I would like to discuss with you about this concept of discussing the concept of power, not sharing, I want it for me. No, nobody should have it. And then I wanted to underline another thing, which you already said so well. How to make all this information available. And you made the decision, which is fantastic. Make it simple through drawings, through images. Numbers can be so mute and so neutral. You made your numbers the opposite of neutral. You made them blatantly, I wouldn't say gendered, human, understandable. So another thanks to you. And then the other thing, and then I will keep quiet. There is another undertext in your atlas. There is an incredible capacity to delete or make sound very stupid all the possible stereotypes we have in our minds. For example, you already mentioned it, poor country, underdeveloped country against developed countries, or democratic countries against dictatorship. No, you, through your drawings, through your graphic, through your numbers, make very clear that there are all the problems of life in the planet can be everywhere. And this is not something. And then the last thing, differences and similarities. Differences and similarities can be used against women through generalizations, also through very clear tactic or strategies power uses very often to put women, certain women against other women. You make very clear through your research that this cannot be accepted. Generalization can kill, but also the very opposite of generalization. So there is a lot of work to do on that side. So thank you, and I listen to you now.
Thank you, Maria, for your enthusiastic. Joni, you have your microphone turned off.
Sorry.
Okay. Okay.
Should I start in conversation with Maria now, or would other people speak up now? No.
Should I make my questions and then you can address them both?
Sure, as you prefer. Okay, go Sveva.
Okay, right. I also would like to thank, first of all, Florencia and Azzurra and the Casa delle Donne for this invitation and for this occasion to discuss with you about your wonderful book. I like to show it again. It's very well translated also. It must have been a very difficult work, translation of such a complex book. And I can really see when I was reading it that it was growing, you know. It was born almost 40 years ago, and it has been through translations to reworking, and I think really that this work makes the world a better place for us feminists, for people who engage with a gender dimension. And I also imagine that writing it has been also a kind of healing process, a healing, you know, from the violences of patriarchy, a healing through the re-establishment of a different story, through telling a different story. And I have to say that when I was reading the Atlas in the last days, I was constantly thinking, oh my God, what a pity that I did not have it as my school book, you know, my school atlas when I was in elementary school. So I would really suggest teachers to use it. You know, I used it in my classes at university, and it's very helpful. And the second thing that I thought, and Maria already said it a bit, I thought, oh my God, thanks God that you did such an amazing and incredible work, because to organize such a complex data in a comprehensive way must have been very, very complicated. And it's really worth remembering that it's not only about data. It's really a reconstruction of women's life and of women's activism around the world. And as Maria is saying, it struggles with the dimension of power, which is quite complicated. And, you know, yesterday night, I don't sleep much. So yesterday night, I was reading some blogs of Italian literature blogs, so about your book. And I was, I found a word that was repeating in many different blogs, and it's the word esagerata, exaggerated. And many of these bloggers were saying that every time that when they speak about inequalities or about the patriarchy, the most common answer they get is, oh, come on, you're exaggerated, you know, these things are gone, and, you know, now we are in a complete new world. And they were all saying, this atlas helps us to answer to this question, to these remarks. So it's the thank you does not come only from my behalf, but as I have the opportunity to speak with you, I bring you also these comments from these blogs. And just to remember that the feminist gaze is is very powerful. It's able to subvert the ways we categorize the world. It subverts hierarchies. It shows the different forces of the oppression, and your work clearly shows this. You know, also Maria was quoting this. You change and you challenge the borders of what we consider to be a developed or an underdeveloped country. You know, you stress this in the introduction, and you can really see it through the whole book. And I was also thinking that another strength of this gaze that you use in your book and you make stronger through your book is that you shed light onto territories that are, you know, that have been systematically neglected. I personally work on gender-based violence and on care, and every time I speak about these issues, I always think that, you know, it's thanks to the work of feminists since the 1970s, you know, that they were pushing and dragging these issues and these phenomena out of the silence. And this is exactly what you do with your book. And I was reading another recent book about data feminism. It just came out from D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein. It's another amazing book. And they were saying exactly this, you know, the principle of that data feminism is this. It's to examine power, to challenge it, and to show and make visible all the work and the world that has been invisible for such a long time. And it's amazing how you managed to do it with your book and with your work. I think this must have been the most difficult part of it. And you already answered a lot of questions that I wanted to pose, but I'm still curious to know two things from you. Like, if you could just, you know, say, I have a dream about data. We dream about data sometimes. We can say that. We can disclose that. What is missing? What would you really like to have? Because on my behalf, my dream about data would be to have data about men that are violent, that act violent in intimate partner relationships. So I would like to know more about them. And the other thing that I would like to ask you is, what, if you think already about the next edition, what would you like to include in your next edition? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Should I jump into response now?
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Okay.
Feel free.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for such great comments and such it makes me very happy to have your praise. And because I get a lot of criticism for this atlas from there's a lot of pushback sometimes about some of the comments that you mentioned, Sveva, that people sometimes feel that that feminist analysis of women's condition are exaggerated. And I think we have a lot of work to do to counter that myth. And I think that it's easy to believe that some of the inequalities and injustices for women are exaggerated simply because the problems are not visible. So if I had to say what's the one overwhelming contribution that I would hope for this book, is to make things visible. Now, you know, I go through this atlas. I have here the British edition, and I don't know the answers to a lot of the questions in here. I don't know why there are certain patterns. I certainly don't know. I'm not a specialist in, you know, a couple hundred topics. So there are many times that I look at the data and I think, wow, that's really interesting, or wow, that's surprising. And I don't necessarily view this book as answering questions, but actually raising questions. That is, I want other people to look at a particular map spread and say, wow, why is that the pattern? And what's going on there? And why do we see this, whatever the topic is, why do we see this topic in the manifest in the way it does? But I think that both of you hit on a theme that I think is one of the most important. I mean, this book is primarily going to be read and is going to be available to people in the rich, Western, industrialized world. I mean, frankly, that's the readership. And as I said in my comments, often we, and because I include myself as one of those inhabitants of the post-industrialized rich world, we have a lot of biases or a lot of kind of sweeping understandings of what's going on for women over there. And but both Maria and Sveva have picked up this theme that I really feel is very important about not making quick and easy, facile judgments about the differences between us and them. And if you will let me, I just want to read 2 paragraphs from my introduction. I know that it's not much fun when an author reads from her own book, but just bear with me and let me read 2 paragraphs. In the world of women, there are few developed nations. Looking at the world through the experiences of women raises questions about the validity of conventional distinctions between developed and underdeveloped countries. Women hold the same proportion of representation in governments in Madagascar, the USA, and Kyrgyzstan. The indifference of the state to the murder of indigenous women in Canada, Yazidi women in Iraq, and Maquiladora women in Mexico offers a sharp rebuke to the notion of the modern state. Married women in South Korea, the UAE, and Malawi all need their husband's approval for an abortion. These may seem to be cheap shots, glib comparisons that don't acknowledge the real advances in women's lives. But for the women living under these realities, it is glib to say that things are getting better for women somewhere else. A rising tide does not necessarily lift all boats. Women do not automatically share in broad social advances unless there is a commitment to social equity. Feminists have long warned that gains in women's empowerment should not be taken for granted. They are fragile, reversible, and always under pressure. This warning has never seemed so pertinent. From Poland to the USA, from Nigeria to Russia, the halls and hallmarks of power remain remarkably unperturbed by the oppression of women. So I'll stop reading there. But the similarities of the status of women and the pressures that women face around the world are as striking as the differences. And that's one of the points I hoped to make through this book. And I'm so glad that both Maria and Sveva picked that up. And I think that exactly as Maria said, my quest in this book is to deconstruct power and to say, what does power look like? Most men and most women in the world lead very ordinary lives. Most men don't think of themselves as having power, but even ordinary men and ordinary women have very different experiences of their opportunities and their barriers. So power is not necessarily on a grand scale, but even on a kind of a small scale, we can see the workings of power. And that's why I love to introduce things such as household unpaid labor. I mean, that's a very small scale of the expression of power.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, anytime.
So, you've been saying so many things that are food for thought. but in order to make visible things, as you were saying, I would just like to throw a thought and maybe, you know, half of a thought and half of a provocation. You can read it as you want. But somehow if you scroll down on the, at least in this Zoom room, the presence of people following is basically all women. So my question would be, you know, where is man in all of this? Because to a certain extent, you know, I'm quite convinced that there is, so feminism has to do with men's role, right? So very often we are facing situations or, you know, this kind of presentation or public discourse in which we end up being all women. But my personal stand would be that we need to find kind of common ground. We need to find ways to somehow, I don't know if change men, at least try to, you know, deal with masculinity as a paradigm. Okay, it's not, my understanding is not a matter of sex. It's not a matter of if you're men or women. Is more, you know, the paradigm that you refer to. Somehow there are many women that are embodying masculine principle and vice versa. So to me, it is not a matter, you know, of what sex you belong to. But somehow I think also that a common ground must be found in order to be transformative somehow, in order to, you know, pass from reading and critical analysis, which is fundamental, and, you know, your book is great about this. But then what do we do? Why are we all women in the room? This is not just for Joni, it's, you know, either also I think Maria or Sveva or whoever, you know, wants to jump in. I think it's a more of a open conversation.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. I was about to turn the question back to you, because this is a very, very, very common feature. I mean, I'm often in meetings, as I'm sure everyone is, on, you know, gender and the environment, or gender and this, that, and the other. It's always women. It's always 98% women, just as a rough guesstimate. So I would just say that by asking, going back to Maria's earlier comment, by kind of asking where the women are, by being curious about women. And in this atlas, I do map some specific things about men, but kind of by definition, if you ask where the women are, you're also asking where the men are. But I think that's an interesting question that you raise, a really important question about why are more men not engaged in these really big social debates around privilege, power, roles. I mean, we all know individual men who are, we could probably name a few of our friends, but that's not the question. So I would say, back to you. Why do you think?
Someone from whom Valentina Ceccatelli is trying to comment this question, and she says, how can I make a man understand what we as women have to experience every day when they can't even imagine it, when it's like it doesn't even exist for most of them? Yeah, we have to talk more. I don't know. I can't answer this question.
Can I just jump in on that?
Please.
Sure.
It's a question that is around in the feminist movement since not many years, but some years. And we saw here in Italy and in Europe something that, you know, sometimes, you know, we can find the fourth wave of feminism, and it's, for example, non una di meno, all the younger, you know, I'm around 40 and something. The younger generation is the new generation of feminists, and we can see that men are part of the discussion since the beginning. So this is, I also think, very important, and we have to. If I speak about, so there are men that engage with these issues, not enough, you know, but it's changing, I think, the horizon. And what I see, for example, in my classrooms when I discuss with my students, so men and women are in their 20s, that if you manage to speak about masculinities, so to show how, you know, this cultural construct of masculinity is bad also for men, then a lot of men open up and begin to speak. It's a, you know, they're not ready yet to make this first jump first, but, you know, if you begin to open up the dimension of gender, so gender is not a synonym of women, but it's a relational concept, and masculinities is a plural concept, then you begin to hear stories that men tell.
May I say something? Yeah.
Maria.
So I wonder how comes we keep thinking about men all the times. We have to say them, we have to tell them, we have to explain them. I think enough with this. I think it's more interesting to discuss among us and to worry about another major problem, which is that women are not all the same. There are real differences among women. And so, for example, I know through experience that power is a problem, is a disease also for women. So that is more interesting. It's something we can work on. I don't think we have a power to change men, but we certainly can work on changing ourselves and other women. So, to be very pragmatical, for example, even if I know it's a difficult matter, because when one speaks about the differences among women, one goes into a delicate and fragile and very soft soil. But really, I believe that we should work on that. And Joni and her book provide us with certain tools. So what I would like not to happen, not to take place, is to watch at the maps Joni gave us and start crying and saying, we are victims here, we are victims there. No. I believe that we should work her book as a major tool for clarification. And when matters become more clear, they become more clear for everyone, including men. But it's not the real, I don't think it's the real target Joni had in mind when she did her book. And for example, and again, thanks to Joni, when Joni in her very first speech made clear that she was moved by curiosity, she was making a statement which is absolutely political. Women should be moved by curiosity, as she was moved by curiosity, not by lack of power, sense of impotence, desire to persuade and convert men. Let's stay on our land. Let's stay here and see what we can do with other women, and not to be hypocritical, not to be certain women are more dangerous than certain men, for example, everywhere. So back to Joni, what do you think about this?
Well, I mean, this is such a rich and complicated conversation, and you all have, you know, raised and shed light on such complicated things. But I think that it is true that we need to work in feminist coalitions. I think that we need to, that feminist movements are at their best when they take account of the range of women and women's experiences, and whether that's by class or by age or race, ethnicity, or religion. We need the most successful feminist movements are those that have the broadest coalitions. And so I think that some of what I see, as Sveva said, some of what I see with young people is particularly heartening, because many of the younger activists are almost instinctively coalition builders. And I think that we need to always have that at the front of our minds. And I also think that shifting the, I agree with you, Maria, we don't always need to ask, and we ask too much about men. Where are the men? You know, it's like, fine, they'll do their own stuff. Let them figure it out. But on the other hand, I think that raising questions about masculinities and femininities and exploring how those large social formations are not really optional for anyone, or that they have influence on everyone. And it's really, individual men should not be worried about whether individual women are going to compete with them in the workforce or are going to take their power. But we really need to look at how our masculinities and femininities constructed. And that should be what our coalition effort is, to dismantle and change, and to say, well, what are the useful and what are the really destructive parts of these large structures that in some ways are not optional for any of us. There used to be a saying when I was a younger feminist, that patriarchy is not optional, meaning we are all influenced by the large structures of patriarchal oppression, men and women. But I kind of like Maria's approach of, it's like, let's just focus on women for now, and we'll come back to the men sometime later. But maybe that's not a productive approach in terms of what I was also saying about coalitions. But what do other people think?
Can I ask a question? It's very practical, but at the same time, it isn't, because it concerns what we were talking about earlier. That's the availability of the data and of this work for women living in non-industrialized countries, North America and Europe. So I was thinking, in what languages the book is available until now? If it's available, for example, in Spanish or Portuguese and French for my friends in North Africa, I would love to comment to make it available for them. And another question, which is, you have, in what you have presented, there were many examples at one side of the world and at the other side of the United States. Is that the general approach of the book? Is it much centered on the United States or not? Very practical.
Yeah, no, great. I appreciate it. And I think that you put your finger on a really important dilemma that confronts many of us who work, for me, who work in English and work in the rich industrialized world, how information can be made available. So this atlas in particular has been published in editions in French, German, Spanish, and Japanese, as well as English. The Spanish, I just heard from my publisher, my British publisher, that the Spanish publisher did not have much success with this atlas, and they're apparently pulling it out of circulation. So I don't know that it's going to be available much longer. I don't even think I have a copy of it, or maybe I have one copy, but it theoretically is available. In terms of how much of this focuses on the US, I tried very hard, although I'm based in the US, I'm also Canadian, so I'm often very tired of the dominance of the US, but the US is a very data-rich country. And one of the reasons that it's data-rich for these kinds of things is it's one of the very few countries that disaggregates a lot of information by race. It's actually very, there's a really robust debate about whether, well, there's a really large debate about whether official data systems, the extent to which they are or could be used as tools of surveillance and social control. So there's a lot of nervousness about being counted. There's also a lot of reason to want to have a more inclusive count, in brackets, count, but very few countries, very, very few countries routinely collect data by race or ethnic categories. And there's, as I said, there's debate about whether that's good or bad. Maybe ethnic minorities are better off not being visible by official systems of data. Maybe they're worse off. But anyway, so one of the reasons why the US is more present in this book than it otherwise probably should be is because it's got great data. But that being said, no, I did not want this to be a US centric book. And there's lots and lots and lots of places where the US or Western Europe is not even mentioned at all. So I really tried to be aware of that. But I think a new reader coming to it might notice, as you do, that there is quite a bit of US focus.
May I ask you a question?
Sorry.
May I ask a question?
Then maybe I would like to make a question, and then we have to close. So please.
Okay. Was it hard to find data about countries which has like strict policies, like Poland or maybe Turkey or Africa? Was it hard to find these data?
Yes, in a short word, yes. And there are a couple of problems. One is I operate primarily in English. I could struggle through in French, but that's kind of my two languages, would be English and French, not so much, but enough. However, I could not do this atlas or anything like this by looking at each individual country. I mean, there are approximately 192 countries. I would need at least a couple of hundred researchers to go and look at specifically the national accounts from Poland and Fiji and from South Africa and from Nigeria. And it's just, I mean, it's just not even imaginably possible. So while I do have many instances in the book where there are specific kind of bits of information about all of those countries that I just mentioned, primarily for large data sets, I rely on international compilations. So the international agencies, including the World Health Organization or more specialized organizations on international lesbian and gay rights, or the World Bank, or, I rely on the large international compilations, and they get their information from those national governments. It gets fed up the data chain, a very problematic data chain. But yes, and there are many, 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 many places where you will open a book or open a page on the internet and it will say data on, for example, women and violence. And you go, great, this is going to be great. What a great resource. And the data sets are blank, 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 blank. And exactly as you say, it's not only blank for the data poor countries, it's blank for many countries who just either don't collect or don't report data on topics they don't want to report on. So yes, it's very problematic.
Thank you.
Can I? I just wanted to introduce another topic before this meeting ends, and because I think it's kind of necessary. I really would like to talk about American elections, because here in Italy, no, but shortly and just about one precise topic, because here in Italy, feminist movements are divided about Kamala Harris' election. From one side, they consider her too conservative. From the other, they say it's a great achievement. I just wanted to know, how do you read her election as a first non-white female vice president of the USA?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's tremendous. I mean, I think it's fantastic. So, I mean, yes, as I often say to people, Joe Biden and then Kamala were not my personal first choice of presidential candidates, but and I don't withhold my right to be critical and to have a critique of they're both centrist politicians. And so I do have, and no doubt will have, a lot more critiques. But at this point, they are great. It is like so fantastic to have both Biden and Kamala Harris. And I think Kamala Harris's multi-intersectional identity is a very important step forward for the US. I say, by no means a perfect candidate, by no means a perfect politician. I would have disagreements with her, and I'm sure I will, and I'm sure I will be critical of their administration. But first of all, it was so essential that Trump get defeated. It was just so essential. And I think that Kamala's representation is a really major step forward in the US. So I have a critical, I have a critical part of my brain that I can activate when I need to. But for now, I'm not activating it. For now, I'm just thrilled.
Yeah, I can understand after 4 years of Trump's.
A nightmare, a nightmare.
Yeah, if someone wants to ask something, otherwise I have a lot of questions more, but I don't know if we want to go on. Azzurra, what do you think?
Well, let's say we had said, to keep it an hour and a half. So perhaps, if somebody has urgencies and things that absolutely need to be, there you go. There is another question by Valentina. How can you explain the fact that a lot of women voted for Trump with what he did to women's rights?
Yeah. Well, I mean, how can you explain the fact that any racial minorities voted for Trump? How can you explain the fact that white women voted for Trump? I think we have to go back. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. On the one hand, it's mind-boggling and terrible. On the other hand, let's engage our feminist curiosity again and go back to discussions of, patriarchy is not optional for anyone. Certainly white women benefited in some ways, not in many ways, but in some ways they benefited from the white supremacy that Trump promoted. They benefited from the conservative programs that Trump was promoting. And it's very hard for women to separate out their interests as women, if they don't see their interests as women, from those large social structures of things such as white supremacy. So I think we have to go back to conversations about patriarchy, about masculinities, about femininities. One of the really interesting little, I'm not an electoral analyst, so my skill is relatively limited here. But one of the interesting thing is that if you track women's voting in the US, women who are married to men become more conservative. That is, you can see their voting patterns change as they, not all women, but there's a notable enough shift that women often vote politically with their husbands. And so that's an interesting dynamic too, kind of the marriage effect on women. Marriage doesn't make men statistically more liberal, it makes women statistically more conservative, which is an interesting electoral effect. So I agree, it's a complicated question. As a rhetorical question, we all throw up our hands and say, oh my God, how could any woman vote for Trump? How could any Black man vote for Trump? How could any Latinx person vote for Trump? But if you dig down a bit, I think you very quickly come into these large social forces.
Yeah, and adding to that, I don't know if you have seen, there is a map of the US vote divided by gender.
Yes, right.
Have you seen that? I mean, one
Yes,
is blue and one is red.
Right, that's right. If all women, if only women voted, Biden would have won by even a larger landslide than he did. And if only men voted, Trump would have won, and by a considerable extent. So there's a very significant gender divide on this, but which still doesn't erase in any way the question that was asked about how do we explain that women voted against what we might view as voted against their own self-interest. But clearly they didn't define it in that way. So then what is their engagement with larger social structures?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, okay. Maybe it's late. Actually, we are losing people here. We're losing people on Facebook. So maybe it's enough. Right. And it was actually great. Everything.
Yeah.
Well, this was a lot of fun. I'm really, really glad that you invited me to participate in your book festival. And thank you very much. And thank you for your comments and observations and for being so enthusiastic about my book. It's wonderful. Wonderful to hear that feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you, Joni. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Sveva, Maria, Anita.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for your book, Joni. Bye.
Siamo solo italiane adesso. Ciao a tutti.